Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today, focusing on just one source.
Right, a single source with a very specific interpretation of a really foundational story.
The fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis.
Uh-huh.
And our source material, it's actually an excerpt from a video. It's titled The Fall and How It Relates to Women. Yeah, so our mission really is just to pull out the key arguments, the insights from this particular source. We want to guide you through its perspective on the story and how it connects Genesis to its view on modern women.
It's a very focused look, isn't it? Just this one viewpoint on what's obviously a huge, complex topic.
Exactly, and we're here to just lay out what this source says.
Yeah, to understand how it builds its case, how it interprets certain verses, certain moments in Genesis 3, and then uses that to make these broader claims about gender today.
Mhm. And it's important, like you said, we're presenting its view, not evaluating it ourselves right now, just showing you the connections it makes.
Absolutely. So where does it start?
Okay, so the source kicks off by zeroing in on that first interaction, serpent and Eve.
Right.
It argues the serpent specifically went to Eve because, and this is the phrase it uses, she is the weaker vessel.
And it tries to ground that scripturally, right?
It does. It points directly to 1 Peter 3.7. That verse talks about the wife as the weaker vessel in the context of how husbands should treat their wives.
And the source takes that phrase, weaker vessel, and interprets it to mean essentially spiritually weaker, or generally more susceptible.
Yeah, weaker or not as spiritually strong. That's the idea. It claims Satan targets weakness.
Hmm.
And it makes a point of saying Satan hadn't gone to Adam about the tree before this, suggesting Adam was, stronger, less vulnerable in the source's reading.
Okay. But then how did Eve even know the rule? She wasn't there when God gave Adam the command initially. Does the source address that?
It does. It concludes Adam must have told her.
Yeah.
And it cites Genesis 2.24 about them becoming one flesh. The source reads that as implying, total sharing of information, including this big command.
Okay, that makes sense within its logic, so Adam told her.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting. According to this source, it focuses hard on what Eve says to the serpent.
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 3, verses 1 to 3.
Okay.
When she repeats the command, she adds something. Nor shall you touch it. That part, touch it, wasn't in God's original words to Adam.
Ah, the addition, I see. So the source sees that as significant.
Very significant. It interprets this addition as Adam giving Eve extra added direction.
Extra direction. Why would he do that?
Well, the source's reasoning is that Adam knew she was the weaker part of him. That's the phrase again. And he anticipated she'd be tempted, so he, intuitively added this extra rule, a buffer zone.
The kind of protective guardrail built by Adam. Yeah.
And this ties into another point the source makes about location, proximity.
Okay.
It knows Eve was near the tree, but it speculates, and this is speculation, that Adam himself never went near it.
So distance versus closeness.
Exactly. And in the source's view, Adam staying away shows his wisdom, his strength against temptation. While Eve being near it, well, it supports their idea that her nature, as the weaker one, drew her closer to the danger.
So building block by building block, interpreting these initial details.
Right. And then it makes the leap. It draws a direct line from this specific reading of the fall to the nature of modern women.
Okay, here we go. How does it connect?
It argues this story explains why men are, the leaders, the logical thinkers. That's their intended role, according to this source.
And women.
And conversely, it claims this story explains why modern women, again, according to this source, have a natural tendency to be nosy, to seek after things, to reject sound instruction advice.
Wow, okay.
And to be drawn to places they shouldn't be, which leads, in its words, to corruption.
That's quite a list of traits linked back to Eve.
It is, and the source is blunt. It says women are not as strong as men, physically or mentally, and it asks, rhetorically, why else would the serpent target Eve and not Adam?
It frames it as self-evident based on the serpent's choice.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
The source also throws in some speculation about what Adam was doing, maybe off naming the animals, right? Doing the work God gave him.
The task he was given, yeah.
And the source uses this to argue that, look, Adam had already given Eve instructions, including that extra don't touch rule.
Yeah.
So this whole modern idea that men need to constantly prove their leadership, the source says that's not true.
So the leadership is inherent, the instruction was given.
Exactly. The problem, from the source's perspective, isn't the leadership. It's women not wanting to listen or follow the leadership that's already there. It goes further, actually. It uses the word delusional to describe modern women who think they're strong and independent. Because according to this interpretation of Genesis, They're inherently not. They need a leader, need guidance.
So the fall narrative is presented as proof of an ongoing inherent need in women for male leadership.
That's the core argument it's building. Now, it also dissects Eve's actual decision to eat the fruit using Genesis 3.6.
Okay, the moment of decision.
The source breaks it down into 3 stages. First, Eve saw the fruit was good for food. The source interprets this as her rationalizing, oh, it's just nutritious.
Stage 1, rationalization.
Stage 2, the more she looked, the source says, the more pleasant to the eyes it became. Desire is growing. It's appealing aesthetically.
Okay, desire builds.
In stage 3, it was desirable to make one wise. And the source really focuses on this. It interprets this as Eve wanting wisdom, like Adam's may be linked to his task of naming animals or maybe even wanting to be equal to God.
So a desire for wisdom, potentially equality, is seen as the final trigger.
Right. And the source contrasts Adam's solo task of naming animals with Eve's role, which it defines purely as being his helper, reinforcing its view of their different designated spheres.
Got it. Okay, so Eve eats, then she gives it to Adam. What's the source's take on Adam's part in this?
This is maybe one of the more surprising interpretations in the source. It suggests Adam had no clue what he was eating.
Really? How does it explain that?
It speculates he was still off working, maybe naming those animals, and Eve just brought him the fruit, and he ate it without knowing it was the forbidden fruit.
So ignorance on Adam's part.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
And the source points to God calling out, Adam, where are you? In Genesis 3.9, it says, this shows God held Adam responsible as the one in charge.
Even if he supposedly didn't know.
Yes, the source connects this to Romans 5.1:12, sin entering the world through one man, Adam, to bolster its argument that Adam bears the ultimate responsibility because he was the leader, the one who got the command first.
So responsibility rests with the designated leader, regardless of who acted first or supposedly knew what.
That's the source's logic. It even suggests God kind of favors man in its view. That's why Adam is blamed, even though Eve initiated the eating, because Adam got the direct instruction from God.
Wow. Okay. And Adam's response to God when he says, the woman you gave me.
The source jumps on that. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate. The source uses this as proof, in its view, that Adam was basically saying, I didn't know what it was, she just gave it to me. That he was essentially tricked.
So not blame shifting, but a statement of fact from Adam, according to this source.
But that's how it's framed. The source even argues that Adam's long relationship with God before Eve existed would have made him too strong to be swayed if he'd actually known it was the forbidden fruit. His ignorance is key to this interpretation.
Okay. Then the focus shifts again.
It does. It shifts to accountability, specifically claiming women have a problem with it.
And the evidence for this claim.
Eve's response to God in Genesis 3.13, the serpent deceived me and I ate. The source presents this as Eve dodging responsibility.
How so?
Because, according to the source, she doesn't take accountability for the choices she made going near the tree, touching it based on the source's extra instruction theory, actions she took before the serpent even deceived her about the consequences of eating.
So the source sees prior actions she should be accountable for.
Right. It asks pointedly, why was she even near the tree if she knew the rules?
Okay. Then comes the punishment, or the consequences laid out by God. How does the source handle that?
It focuses heavily on God's words to the woman in Genesis 3.16. It breaks down those phrases.
Which ones specifically?
Multiplied sorrow in childbirth. Okay. But then, crucially, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you.
Those last two are really central to its argument about modern women, I imagine.
Absolutely. The source interprets your desire shall be for your husband very definitively. It means, in its view, that every woman deep down desires to be with a man and, importantly, wants a man to lead her.
Regardless of what she might say, even if she calls herself an alpha female, as the source material apparently mentions.
Yes. The source claims it doesn't matter what women say. They aren't designed to be alone. It argues wanting marriage, wanting kids, is basically in women's DNA. It uses Eve never being alone and even girls playing with dolls as sort of supporting evidence for this innate desire.
Okay, an interpretation of innate female nature drawn from that verse. What about the he shall rule over you part?
That's where the source makes its most direct hit on modern, specifically Western culture. It argues that modern Western women actively reject this. They don't want a man ruling over them, don't want to be told what to do.
And how does the source view the outcomes of this rejection?
It claims that examples we see independent women, divorcees, single mothers, are evidence that this rejection leads to regret. It asserts they aren't really fine being alone, calling that idea a lie.
A lie.
Yes. It claims they secretly hope to find someone, but often end up having to settle later in life because, these are the source's words, beauty will fade. It is. And it leads to the source's ultimate conclusion on this point, stated very explicitly. Women will either settle and let a man rule over you, or you will die alone.
Wow. A very binary choice presented there, based on its reading of that one phrase.
Extremely binary.
Okay.
Then the source looks at the very end of the chapter, Genesis 3.24. God drives Adam out of Eden, and Eve follows him.
And the source sees this as?
More evidence. Proof that a woman's role is to follow the man, and the man's role is to lead. It loops back to its earlier point. A man doesn't need to prove leadership. It's inherent. A woman's duty is to the man. He rules, she follows. Wherever he goes, she goes. Simple as that, in this view.
So the physical act of following Adam out of the garden becomes symbolic of the ongoing dynamic it promotes.
Precisely. And it all wraps up with a final lesson the source draws from this whole narrative aimed directly at women. Which, essentially, stick by your man, though, at all. Because the source suggests his problems might not always be entirely his fault, thinking back to Adam being tricked, and the woman plays a big role in whether the relationship succeeds or fails.
So the responsibility for relationship longevity is placed significantly on the woman's willingness to follow and support based on this interpretation.
That's the concluding message of this particular source. It's a consistent argument, you have to say, taking specific moments and phrases from Genesis 3 and building this very distinct framework.
A framework for understanding gender, roles, relationships, all tied back to its reading of the fall.
Yeah, wow. So, okay, this deep dive, we've really just walked through the arguments of this one source, how it interprets Genesis 3, connects it to gender roles, women's nature, duties, all from its specific viewpoint.
We covered its points on the serpent's target, Eve's actions, Adam's role and blame as the source sees it, and its interpretation of the punishment, especially that idea of women needing a leader and the husband's rule.
Right. And this source clearly argues that understanding and, frankly, accepting its perspective is fundamental to understanding relationships and women's place. So after hearing all that, just focusing on what this source presented, what stands out to you in this source's very particular interpretation of this ancient and, let's face it, widely discussed story?